The early morning sun cut through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse and danced across Sarah Bennett as she adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. At 52, 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center had bestowed upon her a quiet confidence. Sarah hadn't planned on being in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research on racial disparities in the justice system usually kept her in libraries and behind computer screens, analyzing data and patterns, but something about the recent surge in complaints about discriminatory traffic citations had drawn her from her comfortable office to these hard wooden benches. The courthouse was abuzz with its normal morning activity. Security guards nodded at people they knew. Clerks shuffled papers. Nervous defendants whispered to their lawyers. Sarah watched it all keenly, her notebook on her lap, her pen moving quickly as subtle interactions sketched out how some people were greeted with smiles while others got short nods, how some defendants were interrupted while others were allowed to continue talking. She wasn't just any listener, though few in the room knew it. As one of Georgetown's most respected professors, Sarah had helped shape the minds of untold numbers of legal professionals, including judges presiding today in these very courts. Her articles about judicial bias were required reading in law schools around the country, and her expert testimony had swayed several landmark cases about racial discrimination. But today, however, she sat silently in the back, clad modestly in her blazer and pencil skirt, indistinguishable from any other working professional who happened to be issued a traffic ticket. Her own citation allegedly for parking incorrectly on K Street was nestled in her briefcase. She had considered just paying the fine online, but something about the circumstances, the unclear signage, the officer's dismissive attitude motivated her to appeal it. The room slowly filled with more, young and old, professional and casual. Spanning the complete, Sarah realized that the spectrum of Washington's diverse population was inherently segregating people, naturally forming invisible, yet definite lines of division. Her trained eye picked up on the anxiety manifested in subways, with defiance across some faces and resignation on others, and still others were showing the confident ease of those familiar with the system. Just at 9 a.m., the BFF's voice boomed with the command for all to rise. Sarah stood with the others straight yet relaxed. She smiled as Judge Michael Harrison entered, his black robes billowing behind him. His reputation preceded him. He was notoriously very hard on traffic infractions, and even more so when the defendants were minorities. What this young judge could not have prepared for was that among the ones he would judge today sat the very professor who had taught him constitutional law and written one of his recommendations for with the appointment to Judge Il. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she watched him take confident stride to the bench. She remembered him as a bright-eyed student, always first to raise his hand, impassioned about justice but sometimes blind to his preconceptions. As the proceedings began and case after case was called, Sarah continued her careful observations, documenting each interaction, each decision, each supple shift in tone. She knew that sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice came not from textbooks or lectures but from real life. Force them to confront their own biases. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become an extraordinary lesson in justice, humility, and the persistent challenge of unconscious bias in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers reviewing the day's docket. With practiced efficiency, at 35, he was one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, and he took immense pride in maintaining strict order in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast as he sipped his black coffee overshadows across the polished mahogany of his desk. His clerk could arrange the day's cases in neat stacks. Parking violations, speeding tickets, and other infractions that most of his colleagues considered mundane. But Harrison sought each case as an opportunity to uphold the law, no matter how small the violation. His reputation for being particularly strict preceded him through the courthouse hallways. Defense attorneys warned their clients about his no-nonsense approach, and even veteran lawyers straightened their ties a little tighter before entering his courtroom. Some whispered that he was trying to prove himself due to his youth, while others suggested he was building a record for higher judicial appointments. Today's docket looked typical. 27 cases, mostly traffic violations. Harrison skimmed through them, making mental notes, His eyes paused briefly on a parking citation issued on K Street, noting the defense named Sarah Bennett. Something about the name tickled at his memory, but he dismissed it. After handling thousands of cases, names often vaguely familiar seem, he donned his black robes. Harrison thought about his law school days at Georgetown, how those halls had shaped him, molded his perception of justice and the law. He remembered heated debates over constitutional rights, over what was fair and equal. Yet in the traffic court, he had made his own sense of justice swift, unyielding, and inflexible. A knock at the door from the bailiff indicated it was time to begin. Harrison motioned to his papers, squared his shoulders, and took a deep breath. He glanced into the mirror and studied his reflection young face, set in serious lines. Dark hair neatly combed, robes perfectly arranged the image of judicial authority head worked so hard to cultivate. Walking through the private corridor to his courtroom, Harrison reviewed his personal rules. Maintain control, show no favoritism, and always uphold the letter of the law. These had served him well in his first year on the bench, earning him respect if not popularity. His mind briefly wandered to his old constitutional law professor, whose lessons about justice and equality had once seemed so clear now. In the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler, black and white, guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bias stood ready at the courtroom door. Harrison could hear the familiar shuffle of people rising on the other side. In moments, he would assume his position of authority, ready to dispense justice as he saw fit, unaware that this ordinary Monday would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness and judgment. All rise, the bay's voice boomed, and Judge Harrison entered his domain, his face stern, confident, and totally oblivious that among those faces now turned toward him was one that would, in due course, remind him of lessons he had invoked, now forgotten on his journey to the bench. The morning went along like most in Judge Harrison's court, efficiently, until case number 47 was called. Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street, the clerk yelled out, the sound of her voice echoing across the busy courtroom. Sarah elegantly rose from her seat, deliberate, dignified, and headed to the podium. Several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She carried herself not with the typical nervousness of a defendant, but with the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, his voice carrying the same stern tone he used. All Ming, Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you play it? Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, not guilty, Your Honor. She began to explain about obstructed signage and confusing rules about parking, but Harrison cut her off mid-sentence. Something had been doing a lot that morning to defendants. Miss Bennett, he interrupted, his tone rising, decidedly impatient. The officer's report clearly indicates you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect? Several observers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. A few regular attorneys exchanged glances, noting how the judge's interruption seemed particularly abrupt this time. Sarah, however, remained unruffled. Your Honor, if I may, she continued with practice calm eye. Have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach. Judge Harrison's expression, hardened head, heard every excuse in the book, and this one was no exception. Miss Bennett, the time of this court is precious. The report of the officer shows no such blockage. As Sarah leaned over to get the photographs from her briefcase, Harrison waved his hand dismissively. That won't be necessary. The onus of knowing and obeying parking laws rests with the driver, not the city. The exchange continued with Sarah retaining her poised manner and Judge Harrison becoming progressively sterner. His answers getting shorter, his voice more concise to the regular core of house. To the observers, it was no more than another case of the young judge exerting his authority. What made this interchange particularly remarkable was the unusual equanimity of Sarah in the face of the judge's growing exasperation. She stood tall and kept eye contact, answering each dismissal with the practiced patience of a person who had spent years teaching others about the very principles of justice being demonstrated in this moment. The tension in the courtroom mounted as the exchange proceeded. Even the buyer shifted in uncomfortably at his post. The other defendants waiting their turn watched with growing interest, sensing that something about this case was different from the routine traffic violations they witnessed all morning. Little did Judge Harrison know that his next decision would transform this seemingly routine traffic case into a moment that would challenge his entire approach to justice. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his decision already formed before Sarah could finish her final statement. The fluorescent lights cast unyielding shadows across his grim features as he gave his sentence. Miss Bennett, this court finds you guilty of contravening City Parking Code 23. For he declare, his voice containing the echo of finality, given your seeming disregard for clearly posted regulations and your efforts to dispute the officer's professional judgment in setting the fine at $500 well above the usual $100 penalty. A murmur of incredulity swept the courtroom. Even the hardy court officers turned to each other in surprise. This was a highly unusual fine for a minor parking ticket. Several lawyers in attendance fidgeted uncomfortably, recognizing that this was an exceedingly disproportionate punishment. Sarah remained frozen in place at the podium, her face unchanging as she stared at Judge Harrison scribbling the fine amount on her citation. His writing strokes were sharp and decisive. The youthful judge had the appearance of a man very much pleased with himself, sure he was sending a very clear message about respect for the rule of law. In addition, Harrison continued, raising his voice to grow more stern, I want it noted for the court record that this court holds in very low disbelief of citizens who try to get out of their duty by challenging the competency of our law enforcement officers. The court clerk furiously typed, recording every word. The frequent attorneys who attended cases in this courtroom had never witnessed such a steep fine for a parking violation. Some started taking notes, feeling this may become relevant in future cases. Sarah spoke, finally, her voice low, and even despite the circumstance, Your Honor, I accept the court's decision. She paused, adjusting her glasses deliberately. However, I should point out that this will unfortunately require me to cut my constitutional law lecture short this afternoon. Judge Harrison barely lifted his gaze from the papers in front of him as he continued to write his final notes on the case. Miss Bennett, your scheduling conflicts are of no consequence to this court. You would have been best served to remember your professional obligations before taking to breaking city parking ordinances. The courtroom was uncommonly still. Even the bailiffs who had seen enough cases in this court, it would seem, since something big was about to. The morning sun had reached its peak outside, casting long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor and illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. Sarah gathered her things, taking her sweet time over it. Every move was slow, calculated, and tranquil. There was no trace of anger or frustration, the usual accompaniment to a sentence as hard as this. Instead, something was in the air, a quieted confidence arising from her that spoke volumes of this case being far from over. Another case was being called right then and there, but eyes were yet fixed on Sarah. She made her way back to her seat, and Judge Harrison, oblivious to the fact that his next epiphany would shake the very foundation of his judicial confidence, had already moved on. Sarah's measured voice carried through the courtroom as she added one last comment. I do need to go home and finish grading papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law. You remember those deadlines well, don't you, Judge Harrison, from when you were in my constitutional law class 10 years ago? The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison's hand froze mid-submature, and the blood drained from his face. The revelation was almost a palpable force as recollections came flooding back. Professor Bennett, standing at the front of the lecture hall challenging students to make deep considerations about justice, fairness, and unconscious bias. Several attorneys in the gallery audibly gasped. The court clerk's fingers hovered motionless above her keyboard. Even the bailiff, always so stoic, struggled to maintain his professional composure. Judge Harrison slowly looked up, really seeing Sarah Bennett for the first time that morning. She stood there exactly as he had remembered her from his days in law school. The same commanding presence, the same inquiring gaze that steered him through complicated constitutional principles. The irony was devastating. Professor Bennett, who had written one of his strongest recommendations for a judicial appointment, who had praised his understanding of equal justice under the law, at last night experienced firsthand how far he had strayed from those principles. Memories cascaded back. Her impassioned lectures about judicial temperament, Her warnings about the civil ways bias could creep into decision-making. Her emphasis on treating every case with equal consideration regardless of the defendant's background. The face of the young judge turned beet red with embarrassment. His earlier SMUD evaporated as he realized that he had just provided a perfect case study and just the kind of biased judgment she had taught him to guard against. Sarah remained standing, neither triumphant nor accusatory, still the teacher, and this became an unexpected lesson. Not just for her former student, but for everybody in the courtroom. The silence was to last an eternity. For regular observers of the court, this was the longest pause they had ever witnessed in traffic court. The morning sun continued its traverse across the courtroom floor, illuminating the drama now, unfolding like on the stage with a spotlight on an extraordinary drama. Judge Harrison looked first down at the excessive fine he had just imposed, and then up again at his former professor. In that instant, he was no longer the confident young judge, but once again the law student who had sat so avidly in her classroom, learning about just such principles which he had just now failed to uphold. The courtroom of Judge Harrison remained as silent and still, as if the weight of recognition weighed upon his shoulders. Staring at Professor Bennett, what a coincidence. His early mentor regarding the meaning of justice. 10 minutes, recess. He called out abruptly, his voice cracking slightly. Across the silent room came the bang of the gavel. Without glancing at anyone, he quickly retired to his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him. Once inside, Harrison collapsed into his leather chair, loosening his collar. His hands still trembled as he pulled out an old Georgetown law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, proudly standing with the constitutional law faculty. Memories flooded back. Her passionate lectures about equal justice, her patient guidance during office hours, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter sat framed on his wall, its words now seeming to mock him. In his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings in his mind. He had interrupted her more quickly than other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount, and he had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The baya knocked softly, indicating the recess was nearly over. Harrison stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The young judge who had prided himself on being firm but fair now appeared for precisely what he was, a man who had lost sight of the basic principles his professor had labored with such dedication to instill. The courtroom hummed with hushed discussions outside his chambers. Attorneys who regularly appeared before him exchanged knowing looks, wondering how this revelation would alter the young judge they knew. Sarah stayed in her seat, grading papers, as if this were just another day in her decades-long career of teaching justice. To future lawyers, her serene manner made the incident all the more touching. She had not come for an argument, but had instead allowed the moment to be a teachable one. Harrison took a few deep breaths, smoothed his robes, and steeled himself to re-enter the courtroom. He knew that the next few minutes would define not only this case, but possibly his judicial career. Judge Harrison re-entered his courtroom, his bearing distinctly altered. The confident stride had been replaced by a much more deliberate walk. His expression now thoughtful rather than stern. Professor Bennett began, my voice carrying a humility that surprised the regular court attendees. I owe you and this court an apology. My conduct this morning failed to meet the very standards of justice you taught me a decade ago. He took a deep breath as he did when preparing to continue. I have allowed my position to blind me from my own biases. Today, you have given all of us a very powerful reminder of the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law. The courtroom remained silent as Harrison picked up Professor Bennett's citation. I find vacating the $500 fine. Further, I hereby dismiss this case in its entirety based upon that ambiguous signage to which you drew the court's attention. Sarah nodded graciously. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Professor Bennett, your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't mere classroom theory. They were principles I swore to uphold. Today, I failed to live up to those principles. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Let this be a reminder to everyone, present myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice rather than not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears and see each person before us with clear eyes, the regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances. This was unheard of, a judge publicly admitting his bias and correcting his mistake. Several started taking notes, realizing they were observing something special in the history of the court. Sarah spoke finally, her tone retaining the instructive inflections she had employed in so many lectures. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. This is what our legal system is based not just on rules, but on the humility and wisdom of those who interpret them." The shift in the courtroom was palpable. What had begun as a blasé session of traffic court had evolved into a powerful teaching about justice, about humility, and about the ongoing challenge of unconscious bias. The other defendants and the lawyers in the courtroom that day witnessed Harrison run the rest of the day's proceedings with a conspicuous change in approach. More patient, more attentive, more balanced in his considerations. 3 months after the incident in the courtroom, Georgetown Law, the school's principal auditorium, was fully packed. Presiding Judge Michael Harrison was at the podium along with Professor Sarah Bennett, addressing a mesmerized audience of law students and faculty. As to what transpired that day in traffic court, Harrison illuminated wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about realizing just how easily our prejudices can cloud our judgment, even when we think we're being fair. The case had become a potent teaching tool at Georgetown Law. Professor Bennett had integrated it into her curriculum, using it to demonstrate how unconscious bias could reveal itself even in low-level legal disputes. The story had spread beyond Georgetown, ran in legal publications and judges' continuing education courses nationwide. Judge Harrison's courtroom had become different. Typical lawyers observed the dramatic change in his demeanor. Every case was scrutinized with due diligence without regard to defendant's physical appearance or ethnicity. His notoriety as toughest judge gradually gave way to being thought of as one of the more open-minded jurists on the bench. Professor Bennett had turned the incident into a seminal research paper entitled Justice in the Mirror, Examining Judicial Bias in Minor Courts. Already, the paper was informing judicial education programs nationally. Sometimes, Professor Bennett told an audience, the most critical teachable moments about justice come from the most uncomfortable moments. What is important isn't that we screw up, but how we act when our biases are exposed. The incident sparked a larger discussion inside the D.C. court system. Other judges began reviewing their own decision-making patterns, led to new guidelines concerning the disposition of traffic court cases. Statistical analysis indicated a dramatic reduction in disparate sentencing within demographic groups. At the end of the lecture, one student asked Judge Harrison what had learned most from the experience. He smiled reflectively prior to his response. Justice isn't just about knowing the law. It's about remaining humble enough to recognize our own prejudices and brave enough to correct them. The case had become known as the professor's lesson, a reminder among law students that true justice requires constant self-examination and the courage to admit when we've fallen short of our ideals. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. Judge Harrison stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor who had shaped his early understanding of justice. His hands gripped the wooden bench, knuckles turning white. 10 minutes recess, he announced abruptly. The gav's sharp crack resounded around the silent chamber. Not meeting anyone's eyes, he quickly retreated into his chambers, black robes billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Once inside, Harrison sank into his leather chair, his hands shaking as he pulled an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, her kind but challenging eyes staring back at him through time. Memories came flooding back, like from a burst dam. Her passionate lectures about equal justice under law, her patient guidance during office hours when he struggled with complex constitutional concepts, and most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter set, framed on his wall, its words now seeming to mock his recent actions. In the quiet of his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings with growing horror. He had interrupted her more quickly than other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount. And he had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The shame burned in his chest as he recalled her lessons about judicial temperament and unconscious bias. How many times had she warned their class about the subway's prejudice could creep into decision-making now? He had become a perfect case study in everything she had taught them to guard against. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, whispers raced through the gallery. Attorneys who regularly appeared before Harrison exchanged knowing looks. Court officers tried to maintain their professional composure, but even they couldn't help glancing at Professor Bennett with newfound respect. Sarah remained unruffled, grading papers as though this was just another teachable moment in her decades-long career. The calmness in her manner made the situation all the more touching. She hadn't come seeking confrontation, but instead allowed the moment to become a powerful lesson in justice and humility. The bay knocked SL on Harrison's chamber door, signaling the recess was all but over. The young judge stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The stern disciplinarian who had prided himself on being firm but fair now appeared as precisely what he had become, a man who had lost sight of the fundamental principles his professor had fought so hard to instill as he prepared to return to the courtroom. Harrison knew the next few minutes would define not only this case, but perhaps his whole judicial career. The weight of the moment rested upon him as he squared his robes and summoned his courage to confront the reality about himself and his actions. He reflected upon what Professor Bennett would ask of him at this very moment, not excuses, nor defensiveness, but honest self-reflection and a willingness to correct course. Those lessons she had taught so many years ago were about to be put to their greatest test, but not in a classroom discussion. The real-world application was the true test. The next knock on his chamber door was more insistent. The recess was ending, and decisions had to be made. With a final deep breath, squaring his shoulders, Judge Harrison prepared to show if he could live up to the principles instilled in him by Professor Bennett all those years ago.